Welcome to the Battleground Chronicles World War II channel. Subscribe to our channel because every day we publish stories about the valor of American soldiers based on real events. Support us. Like our videos if you like what we do for you. January 17th, 1944. 2100 hours. Leary Valley, Italy. Sergeant David Knowles of the 36th Texas Division crouched in the muddy hollow, his body shivering uncontrollably as the frigid water seeped through his boots and soaked his uniform. The January rain had been merciless for weeks, transforming the once dry Italian countryside into a quagmire of thick, clinging mud and swollen waterways. Above them loomed Monte Cassino, its ancient Benedictine monastery silhouetted against the night sky like a medieval fortress, watching, waiting. Knowles checked his watch by the dim light of a shielded flashlight. The hands seemed frozen in place, much like the men huddled around him. 3 days ago, they had received their orders. The 36th Division would cross the Rapido River and establish a bridgehead near the town of Sant'Angelo. Their mission was to punch a hole through the German Gustav line, allowing armored units to break through and race toward Rome. Simple on paper, a death sentence in reality. "We're going to die here," whispered Private Jenkins, his voice barely audible over the constant drip of rain and distant artillery. Everyone knows it, even the general. Knowles couldn't argue. Division Commander, Major General Fred Walker, had made his doubts clear in his diary just hours earlier. "I do not see how we can possibly succeed. According to history, we may not succeed." The monastery on the mountain seemed to stare down at them with cold indifference. For centuries, it had watched civilizations rise and fall, armies march and retreat, men live and die. Now it would bear witness to another slaughter. In the distance, the Rapido River churned angrily, swollen by weeks of winter rain. The same rain that had turned their foxholes into water-filled graves and their uniforms into sodden, freezing prisons. Beyond the river waited the German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, veterans of North Africa, battle-hardened and deeply entrenched in fortifications they'd spent months perfecting. Knowles stared up at the looming shadow of Monte Cassino. Something about the mountain filled him with dread beyond the rational fear of combat. Perhaps it was the way it dominated the landscape, or the knowledge that from its heights, German observers could see every move they made. What he didn't know then, what none of them knew, was that over the next 4 months, more than 55,000 Allied soldiers would fall on this blood-soaked ground, making Monte Cassino one of the most brutal battles of the Second World War. The rain continued to fall, washing away footprints almost as soon as they were made, as if the earth itself was erasing all evidence of the men who would soon cease to exist. January 19, 1944, Rapido River Valley. Lieutenant Colonel William Martin of the 143rd Infantry Regiment, 36th Division, stood on the eastern bank of the Rapido River, binoculars trained on the far shore. The bitter cold pierced through his wet uniform, but he barely noticed it anymore. After weeks in these conditions, the cold had become a constant companion. "It's a killing zone," he muttered to Captain Henry Brooks beside him. "The whole West Bank is mined, with clear fields of fire. And the river—" He didn't need to finish. They both could see it. The Rapido, normally a modest stream, had transformed into a raging torrent, over 15 feet deep in places, with a current strong enough to sweep away a fully equipped soldier in seconds. Their inadequate rubber boats, designed for calm waters, would be nearly impossible to control. Behind them, engineers struggled to move the assault boats through the mud. Vehicles became hopelessly mired, forcing men to carry the heavy equipment by hand over terrain that sucked at their boots with each step. The approach to the river had not been cleared of mines. There hadn't been time. Men would have to navigate the minefield in darkness, carrying boats, while German artillery zeroed in on their positions. The weather had conspired against them. Constant rain had turned the ground into a quagmire and made the river impassable. Clouds prevented air support. Everything that could go wrong had. "This is a suicide mission," Brooks said quietly. "The men know it too." Martin nodded grimly. Walker tried to talk Clark out of it, proposed alternatives. Clark wouldn't budge. Lieutenant General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army, had been adamant. The 36th Division would cross the Rapido precisely where the Germans expected them, despite the overwhelming disadvantages. The attack was meant to draw German forces away from Anzio, where an amphibious landing was planned. The 36th Division was to be the sacrificial lamb. As darkness fell, Martin watched his men preparing for the assault. Many were writing letters home. Final letters, he knew. Veterans could sense when an operation was doomed. The newest replacements, those who had joined after the bloodbath at San Pietro just weeks earlier, looked around nervously, taking their cue from the grim faces of the experienced men. In the command tent, divisional staff gathered around maps, making final adjustments to a plan few believed would succeed. General Walker's aide recounted later that the commander had written in his diary, "I do not know of a single case in military history where an attempt to cross an unfordable river that is incorporated into the enemy's main line of resistance has succeeded." The rain intensified as night fell, drumming on helmets and washing away the penciled coordinates on damp maps. From the mountain above, German artillery observers watched the unmistakable signs of an army preparing for assault and adjusted their guns accordingly. The first ranging shots landed near the assembly areas, sending geysers of mud into the air. "They see everything we're doing," Brooks observed, his voice flat with resignation. "Of course they do," Martin replied. "They're looking right down our throats." From their vantage point on Monte Cassino, the Germans had a panoramic view of the entire valley. Every movement was visible, every position exposed. It was as if the mountain itself was their enemy, collaborating with the Germans to ensure maximum carnage. As Martin looked up at the mountain one last time before darkness completely enveloped them, a single light seemed to flicker in the monastery windows. Though he knew it was likely his imagination, the abbey was supposedly unoccupied. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the freezing rain. The men would cross tomorrow night. Most would never return. January 20, 1944, 1600 hours, Command Post, 36th Division. Major General Fred Walker sat alone in his tent, the canvas walls shuddering in the wind and rain. Before him lay the operational maps for the coming assault, each contour line and elevation marker representing terrain that would soon be soaked with American blood. Outside, the sounds of final preparations continued. The rumble of trucks, shouted orders, and the occasional distant explosion of German artillery finding its mark. Walker was a decorated veteran of the First World War, where he had earned the Distinguished Service Cross for heroism at the Marne River in France. He understood river crossings better than most, which was precisely why he had argued so strenuously against this one. But Lieutenant General Clark had been unmoved by his objections, and orders were orders. Walker opened his diary and made what would become one of the most quoted entries of the Italian campaign. "Tonight, the 36th Division will attempt to cross the Rapido River opposite San Angelo. We have done everything we can, but I do not see how we can succeed. The river is the principal obstacle of the German main line of resistance. I do not know of a single case in military history where an attempt to cross an unfordable river that is incorporated into the enemy's main line of resistance has succeeded, so according to history, we may not succeed." The division he commanded was not the same one that had landed in Italy months earlier. San Pietro and the battles before it had bled them white. The 36th was under strength, with many new, inexperienced officers and enlisted men. They had been in constant combat for months, with little rest and inadequate reinforcements. Now they were being asked to perform what Walker believed was an impossible task. A knock on the tent pole interrupted his thoughts. Colonel William Wilbur, his chief of staff, entered, rainwater streaming from his helmet. "Sir, the 141st and 143rd are moving to their assembly areas. The engineers report problems with the boats." Walker nodded grimly. "What kind of problems?" "The current's stronger than expected. They're concerned the boats won't hold together, especially with the weight of fully equipped men." Another piece of the disaster falling into place. The rubber assault boats they'd been issued were designed for calm waters, not the raging torrent the Rapido had become. Many had been damaged in transport through the muddy approach routes. Others had been patched repeatedly and leaked air. And the bridges? Wilbur's expression told the story before he spoke. The prefabricated sections can't get through the mud to the launch sites. The engineers are trying to break them down into smaller pieces and carry them forward. Walker closed his diary. The men know what they're facing? Yes, sir, they know. That was the worst of it. The knowledge that his men understood they were being sent into a meat grinder. The veterans especially could read the signs. They knew what a properly prepared assault looked like, and this wasn't it. As Wilbur left, Walker stepped outside his tent and looked toward Monte Cassino. Though miles away and shrouded in rain clouds, its presence seemed to fill the entire valley, a looming harbinger of doom. The monastery at its peak was supposedly neutral territory, unoccupied by German forces. But Walker, like many Allied commanders, suspected the Germans were using it as an observation post. From its heights, they could see every movement in the valley below. In the gathering dusk, he watched his men making final preparations. Some cleaned their weapons methodically. Others wrote letters home or simply sat in silence, lost in their thoughts. These were his men, his responsibility, and in a few hours many of them would die in an assault he had argued against but was powerless to prevent. The wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of a German Nebelwerfer battery firing from the heights. The distinctive moan of the rockets, moaning minis, the men called them, filled the air moments before explosions erupted along the eastern bank of the Rapido. Somewhere men were screaming for medics. Walker turned away. There was nothing more he could do now except wait for the slaughter to begin. January 20, 1944, 1900 hours, eastern bank of the Rapido River. The artillery barrage began precisely at 1900 hours. 31,000 shells fired in support of the crossing. The valley erupted in a hellscape of noise and fire as American artillery pounded the German positions on the western bank. Private James White, a 19-year-old replacement with the 36th Division, pressed himself into the mud as the concussions washed over him, the ground trembling beneath his body. "This is it," shouted his squad leader over the din. "When the barrage lifts, we move." White nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. Around him, other soldiers made last-minute equipment checks or whispered prayers. Many crossed themselves. A few vomited from fear. The initial plan called for the 141st and 143rd Infantry Regiments to cross simultaneously, establishing bridgeheads that would be reinforced once the engineers constructed bridges for vehicles and heavier weapons. The 142nd Regiment was held in reserve, but plans, as the veterans knew, rarely survive contact with the enemy. At 2,000 hours, the barrage lifted, and the men rushed forward toward the river with their boats. Immediately, German artillery and mortars opened fire with devastating accuracy. They had waited out the American bombardment in deep bunkers, emerging unscathed to man their guns. Illumination flares burst overhead, turning night into day and exposing the Americans struggling through the mud with their awkward burdens. "They're waiting for us!" someone screamed as a mortar round landed among a boat team, sending bodies and equipment flying. White's team reached the riverbank, sliding down the muddy slope to the water's edge. The current was even stronger than they'd been told, a churning brown torrent filled with debris. They lowered their boat into the water, holding it against the pull of the river. "Get in! Go, go, go!" the squad leader shouted. Men piled in, overloading the frail craft. As they pushed off, a machine gun opened up from the opposite bank, bullets stitching the water around them and tearing through the boat's fabric. Water began flooding in immediately. "Paddle! For God's sake, paddle!" But the current seized them, spinning the boat as men desperately tried to make headway. White saw other boats suffering similar fates. Some overturned immediately, dumping fully equipped men into the freezing water where they sank like stones. Others were torn apart by machine gun fire, or shredded on underwater obstacles the Germans had placed. Their boat struck something underwater with enough force to throw 2 men overboard. Their screams were quickly silenced as they disappeared beneath the surface, the weight of their equipment dragging them down. The boat itself began breaking apart, water pouring in through multiple tears. "Abandon boat! Swim for the far shore," the squad leader ordered. White slipped into the freezing water, the shock of it driving the breath from his lungs. The current caught him immediately, tumbling him downstream as he fought to keep his head above water. His waterlogged equipment dragged at him, pulling him under. In desperation, he released his rifle, watching it disappear into the murky depths. All around him, men were drowning, their screams punctuated by the constant crack of German machine guns and the thunderous explosions of artillery. The water itself seemed alive with splashes as bullets struck its surface. Somehow, by strength and luck, White reached the far bank, dragging himself up the muddy slope into the teeth of German fire. He collapsed behind a small depression, gasping for breath, his uniform soaked and freezing in the January night. Looking back across the river, he saw a scene from hell. Boats shattered or overturned, men thrashing in the water or lying still on both banks, vehicles ablaze, and through it all, the constant stream of tracers and explosions as the Germans methodically massacred the exposed Americans. Of the other 7 men in his boat, White saw no sign. Later, he would learn that only 2 others had survived the crossing. Of his platoon of 40 men, only 11 would make it across, and only 3, including himself, would survive to be taken prisoner. The first wave was being annihilated, but behind them, the second wave was already moving forward, carrying their boats down to the killing zone that the Rapido had become. From the heights of Monte Cassino, German observers adjusted their artillery with cold precision, turning the eastern bank of the Rapido into a charnel house where American reinforcements died before they could even reach the river. January 21, 1944. 0200 hours. Western bank of the Rapido. Captain Robert Monroe of the 143rd Regiment surveyed the pitiful remnants of his company on the western bank of the Rapido. Of the 184 men he had led to the river hours earlier, fewer than 40 had made it across, and many of those were wounded. They had established a tenuous foothold in a drainage ditch about 100 yards inland, but they were isolated, out of contact with other American units, and running dangerously low on ammunition. "Any word from battalion?" he asked his radio operator, Private Collins, who had miraculously managed to keep his SCR 536 handy-talkie dry during the crossing. Collins shook his head. "Nothing, sir. I think the battalion CP took a direct hit." "There's no response from anyone." Monroe nodded grimly. That matched what he had seen as they crossed, a massive explosion on the eastern bank where the battalion command post had been set up. If the battalion commander and his staff were dead, his company was effectively on its own. "What about the other companies?" he asked. "I've made contact with what's left of Baker Company," Collins replied. "They're about 200 yards south of us with maybe 30 men. Charlie Company didn't make it across at all." German machine guns opened up again, forcing everyone lower into the drainage ditch. The mud was freezing, but it provided the only cover available. Monroe had expected to find prepared positions to assault on the western bank. Pillboxes, bunkers, trench lines. Instead, they had found only mud, mines, and pre-sighted machine guns that cut down anyone who moved. The survivors of his company looked to him with hollow eyes. Many were wounded but refused evacuation. Crossing back over the river seemed even more suicidal than staying where they were. They had no stretchers anyway, and the boats that had made it across were mostly destroyed. "Listen up," Monroe said, gathering the remaining NCOs. "We hold this position until reinforcements arrive. The 142nd should be crossing soon, and they'll break through to us." The men nodded, but Monroe could see they didn't believe it. Neither did he. The 142nd would face the same killing ground they had, and the Germans were even more prepared now. As if reading his thoughts, the eastern sky lit up with a massive barrage as German artillery pounded the American assembly areas. Through his binoculars, Monroe could see the second wave's crossing attempt disintegrating under fire. Boats flipped, men fell, and the few who made it into the water were swept downstream or cut down by machine gun fire. "They're not coming, are they, sir?" asked Sergeant Delacroix, his face caked with mud and blood from a shrapnel wound. Monroe didn't answer. He didn't need to. Dawn was approaching, and with it would come the German counterattack. They all knew it. Without reinforcements, without heavy weapons, Without adequate ammunition, they would be overrun. "We need to withdraw," Monroe said finally. "Before daylight, it's our only chance." "Withdraw? Across that?" Delacroix gestured toward the river where bodies floated past, caught in the current. "Those are our orders now," Monroe said, handing him a soggy piece of paper, a message that had made it across with one of the last boats. "Division is calling it off. Everyone back across." The men stared at him in disbelief. After all they had sacrificed to establish this foothold, they were being ordered to abandon it and brave the killing zone of the river once more. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the valley, they heard the unmistakable rumble of German tanks approaching from the west. The counterattack was coming, and they were out of time. "Move now!" Monroe ordered. "Down to the river. Use whatever you can find to cross. Logs, debris, damaged boats. Go!" The withdrawal was as chaotic and deadly as the crossing had been. German machine guns, now able to see their targets in the growing light, poured fire into the retreating Americans. Men fell on the muddy slope down to the river, their bodies creating macabre steps for those who followed. Monroe was among the last to reach the riverbank. What he saw there stopped him cold. The current had accelerated with recent rainfall, and the crossing points were littered with the dead. Some men tried to swim, only to be swept away. Others clung to debris, making painfully slow progress against the current while bullets splashed around them. "Captain, we've got wounded who can't swim," called Delacroix from a depression nearby. "Use your belts, tie them together," Monroe ordered. "Make lines to pull them across." It was futile, and he knew it. For every man who might make it across using such methods, dozens would die in the attempt. But they had no choice. As German tanks appeared on the ridge above them, Monroe made his decision. "Delacroix, get as many across as you can. I'll hold them off." "Sir." "That's an order, Sergeant. Get them across." Monroe gathered the few men with functioning weapons. They would buy time for the others, though it would cost them their lives. As he set up a final defensive position behind a fallen tree, he looked up at Monte Cassino, looming above them all. In that moment, he understood that the mountain was not just terrain, not just an objective on a map. It was something more, an impassive witness to the folly of men, a monument to human suffering that would claim thousands more lives before the battle ended. The German tanks opened fire, and Captain Monroe turned away from the mountain to face his fate. January 22, 1944, 1800 hours, 36th Division Command Post. Major General Fred Walker stood motionless as the casualty reports came in. His worst fears had been realized, and then exceeded. The crossing of the Rapido River had become one of the most costly failures in American military history. "Final count, sir," Colonel Wilbur reported, his voice hollow with exhaustion. 2,100 casualties, nearly 1,700 men killed, wounded, or missing, most of them presumed drowned or captured. Walker nodded silently. The 141st and 143rd Regiments had been virtually destroyed as effective fighting units. Companies that had gone into action with 184 men were returning with 17 or fewer. Entire platoons had disappeared without a trace, swept away by the river or cut down by German fire. And our objectives? None achieved, sir. We never established a defensible bridgehead. The few men who made it across were forced to withdraw or were captured when the Germans counterattacked at dawn. Outside the command post, the remnants of the two shattered regiments were returning. Hollow-eyed men, many wounded, all bearing the 1,000-yard stare of soldiers who had witnessed horrors beyond description. They moved like ghosts, some still dripping river water, others caked in mud that concealed wounds beneath. Walker stepped outside to see them. He owed them that much. As the men recognized their division commander, some straightened their posture out of ingrained discipline. Others simply stared, their eyes reflecting accusation, or worse, nothing at all. "I tried to stop it," Walker said quietly to his aide. "God knows I tried." An artillery captain approached, his uniform torn and muddied. "Sir, I need to report." Walker nodded. "Go ahead, Captain." "I had 184 men in my company, sir," the captain said, his voice mechanical. 48 hours later, I have 17. If that's not mass murder, I don't know what is. Walker had no response. The captain's words would later be recorded and reported widely, becoming one of the most damning indictments of the operation. That evening, Walker received a communication from 2nd Corps headquarters. Lieutenant General Keyes, the Corps commander, was coming to see him the next day. Walker suspected he knew the reason. Someone would be held accountable for the disaster, and as division commander, the responsibility ultimately fell to him. Alone in his tent that night, Walker wrote in his diary, documenting the catastrophe in precise military language. But between the lines was the anguish of a commander who had sent his men to die in an operation he had known was doomed from the start. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the blood from the banks of the Rapido. On the far side, German soldiers were stripping the dead of useful equipment and gathering American prisoners. The survivors of the 36th Division listened to the distant sounds of artillery as the battle shifted elsewhere. The 34th Division was now attacking north of Cassino, where the terrain was slightly more favorable, though the outcome would be similarly bloody. Monte Cassino still dominated the valley, the monastery on its peak illuminated periodically by flashes of artillery. It would stand for months more as the Allies launched assault after assault, suffering tens of thousands of casualties in their determination to break the Gustav Line. For the men of the 36th Division, the battle for Monte Cassino would forever be defined by those terrible 48 hours at the Rapido River, a slaughter so complete and so unnecessary that it would later be the subject of a congressional investigation. As Walker finished his diary entry, he closed with words that would prove prophetic. The men who survived this will never forget and never forgive. Some wounds go beyond the physical. Outside his tent, the sounds of wounded men moaning punctuated the night, a requiem for those who had fallen in the freezing waters of the Rapido and on its blood-soaked banks. January 24, 1944. Field Hospital, 36th Division Rear Area. The field hospital overflowed with wounded from the Rapido crossing. Surgeons worked around the clock, their aprons stiff with blood, their eyes red from exhaustion. The more seriously wounded had been evacuated to larger facilities when possible, but hundreds remained, their groans forming a constant backdrop to the medical staff's desperate efforts. Lieutenant William Barker of the 141st Regiment lay on a stretcher, his left leg heavily bandaged where shrapnel had torn into it. He was one of the lucky ones. He would keep the leg, though he might always walk with a limp. Around him, men with far worse injuries waited stoically or deliriously for their turn in surgery. Captain John Chapin, commander of Company E of the 141st, approached Barker's stretcher. Chapin's company had been special. It consisted almost entirely of Mexican Americans from Texas. Now, like every other company that had attempted the crossing, it was decimated. "How are you holding up, Bill?" Chapin asked, his voice hoarse with fatigue. Barker attempted a smile that came out as a grimace. "Better than most, sir." "Any word on the rest of the platoon?" Chapin's expression told the story before he spoke. 7 confirmed dead, 12 missing, probably drowned, 3 captured according to German broadcasts. Barker closed his eyes, absorbing the blow. 22 men gone from his platoon alone. Multiply that across the entire division, and the scale of the disaster became clear. "It was a slaughter, sir," he said quietly. "We never had a chance." Chapin didn't disagree. He had seen it himself. Men cut down as they struggled with the unwieldy boats, others swept away by the current, still more gunned down as they reached the far bank. The Germans had been waiting for them, their guns pre-sighted on the crossing points. "The general tried to stop it," Chapin said. "Walker argued against the crossing, said it couldn't succeed. Clark ordered it anyway." This was common knowledge among the officers now. General Walker had opposed the operation from the start, recommending alternative approaches. But 5th Army Commander Mark Clark had been adamant. The 36th Division would cross at the worst possible point, directly into the teeth of German defenses. "Why?" Barker asked. "What was worth this?" "Anzio," Chapin replied. "We were the diversion. They landed at Anzio yesterday while we were dying at the Rapido. The landings at Anzio, codenamed Operation Shingle, had been intended to outflank the Gustav Line by establishing a beachhead behind German lines. The 36th Division's crossing of the Rapido was meant to pin down German reserves, preventing them from responding to the Anzio landing. Was it worth it? Did Anzio succeed? Chapin's laugh was bitter. They got ashore, but last I heard they're sitting on the beach. Lucas won't push inland without more men. They might end up trapped there. Another disaster. A medical orderly approached, indicating it was time to move Barker to a different ward. As they lifted his stretcher, Barker grabbed Chapin's sleeve. "Sir, when you saved me at the river, ordered me to take the wounded back. You knew what you were doing, didn't you?" Chapin's eyes met his. "I knew someone had to survive to tell the truth about what happened there." Barker would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at the Rapido. Chapin would not receive any decoration. He would be killed in action weeks later, but his name would eventually grace a high school in El Paso, Texas, a memorial to the commander of the only all-Mexican-American Army unit in World War II. As Barker was carried away, he looked out the hospital tent's opening toward Monte Cassino. The mountain dominated the landscape, its peak shrouded in clouds. The monastery stood silhouetted against the sky, a reminder that the battle was far from over. For the 36th Division, the worst was behind them. They would be withdrawn, reinforced, and eventually would participate in the breakout from Anzio months later. But the men who had survived the Rapido crossing would never forget the horror of those 48 hours when they had been sacrificed in a futile attempt to cross an unfordable river against an entrenched enemy. In the years to come, the veterans of the 36th Division would demand accountability. Their persistence would lead to a congressional investigation in 1946, seeking to determine if disciplinary action should be taken against those responsible for what they termed one of the most colossal blunders of the Second World War. No officers would ultimately be punished. The official conclusion would be that the crossing, while costly, had been necessary for the overall campaign. Many veterans would disagree until their dying day. Meanwhile, the battle for Monte Cassino continued. 3 more major assaults would be launched before the position finally fell in May 1944. The controversial bombing of the historic monastery, the introduction of Polish, New Zealand, and Indian troops, and thousands more casualties lay ahead. For the men who had survived the Rapido, however, Monte Cassino would always represent something more personal than a military objective. It would be the mountain that had watched impassively as they died in the freezing waters of a river they should never have been ordered to cross. February 15, 1944. Monte Cassino Abbey. The Abbey of Monte Cassino had stood for over 1,400 years, rebuilt several times after earthquakes and invasions. Founded by Saint Benedict himself in 529 AD, it had been a center of learning and spirituality through the centuries. Now it was about to become another casualty of war. Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, stood on an observation point several miles from the mountain, binoculars trained on the monastery. Around him gathered other senior Allied commanders, including Lieutenant General Jacob Devers and French General Alphonse Juin. Conspicuously absent were Lieutenant General Mark Clark and his Chief of Staff, Major General Alfred Grunther, who had refused to attend. "The Abbey must come down," Eaker said firmly. "It's being used as an observation post. Every movement in the valley is visible from there." This was the official justification for what was about to happen, though evidence was circumstantial at best. German General Friedrich von Senger und Etterlin, a Catholic who commanded the 14th Panzer Corps defending Cassino, had specifically ordered his troops not to occupy the abbey, respecting its historical and religious significance. But Allied commanders, frustrated by repeated failures to capture Monte Cassino, were convinced the Germans were using it. "You're making a mistake," Juin said quietly, his experienced eyes evaluating the terrain. "No, they'll never get anywhere this way." His words would prove prophetic. At 09:45 hours, the first waves of American B-17 flying fortresses appeared overhead. For the next several hours, 142 B-17s, followed by 47 B-25 Mitchell and 40 B-26 Marauder medium bombers, pounded the ancient abbey with 1,150 tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs. The mountains shook with the impact, and the historic structure collapsed into a pile of rubble. Many Allied soldiers and war correspondents cheered as they watched the spectacle. They believed destroying the abbey would lead to a breakthrough in the stalemated battle. They could not have been more wrong. Within hours of the bombing, elements of the elite German 1st Parachute Division moved into the ruins. The jumbled stone and debris provided perfect defensive positions, far better than the intact building had offered. The paratroopers, considered by many to be the finest troops in the German army, fortified the ruins and prepared for the Allied assault they knew would follow. The bombing had accomplished exactly the opposite of its intended purpose. It had transformed a neutral historical site into a fortress. On the eastern slopes below the abbey, survivors of the 36th Division watched the bombing from their reserve positions. For them, there was no cheering, only a grim understanding that more blood would be spilled on the mountain that had already claimed so many of their comrades. "They think this will make a difference," said Sergeant Delacroix, one of the few who had survived the Rapido crossing. "All they've done is give the Germans better cover." The next day, troops of the New Zealand Corps launched their attack toward the ruins. They were stopped cold by German paratroopers firing from the rubble that had been created by Allied bombs. The castle-like town of Cassino, at the base of the mountain, became a death trap as New Zealand infantry fought house to house against determined German defenders. The 36th Division men watched with knowing eyes. They had already paid the price of poor planning and unrealistic expectations. Now, others would learn the same brutal lessons. Over the following weeks, 2 more major assaults would be launched against Monte Cassino. Indian Gurkha troops would fight heroically, but fail to dislodge the Germans. New Zealanders would be cut down in the town. The ruins of the abbey would stand defiantly on the mountain peak, a monument to the futility of frontal assaults against prepared positions. Not until May 18, after the Polish II Corps successfully outflanked the position, would Monte Cassino finally fall. By then, over 55,000 Allied casualties would have been suffered in the 4 battles for this single mountain. For the survivors of the 36th Division's crossing of the Rapido, the fate of the abbey seemed a fitting symbol of the entire campaign. Destruction without purpose, suffering without meaning, sacrifice without victory. As spring came to the Liri Valley, the mountain remained, scarred but unmoved by the human drama that had played out on its slopes. Monte Cassino had witnessed centuries of history, and now it had another chapter to add to its long memory. A chapter written in the blood of young men from Texas, New Zealand, India, Poland, Britain, France, Morocco, and Germany. The mountain would remember, even when the world forgot. May 18, 1944. Monte Cassino. Polish troops of the Second Corps raised their red and white flag over the ruins of the Monte Cassino Abbey. After 4 brutal battles and thousands of casualties, the mountain had finally fallen. The Gustav Line was broken, and the road to Rome lay open. For the survivors of the 36th Division, who had been the first to shed blood on the mountain slopes during the ill-fated Rapido crossing in January, the news brought mixed emotions. Vindication, perhaps, but also bitterness at the cost, a cost they had paid more dearly than most. Lieutenant William Barker, now recovered from his wounds and returned to duty, stood with what remained of his platoon as the news spread through the division. They were far from Monte Cassino now, preparing for Operation Diadem, the breakout from the Anzio beachhead that would finally open the way to Rome. "Was it worth it?" asked Private Jenkins, one of the few original members of the platoon who had survived the Rapido. "All those men we lost, just to take a pile of rubble months later?" Barker had no answer. The strategic importance of Monte Cassino was undeniable. It had blocked the Allied advance for months, but the methods used to assault it, beginning with the doomed river crossing by the 36th Division, had turned what might have been a difficult battle into a catastrophic one. 2 weeks later, on June 4, 1944, The U.S. Fifth Army entered Rome. It should have been a triumphant moment, the first Axis capital to fall to the Allies. But the glory was short-lived. 2 days later, the Allies landed in Normandy, and the Italian campaign faded from headlines and public consciousness. For the men of the 36th Division, however, the memories remained vivid. The cold water of the Rapido, the murderous German fire, the sight of comrades drowning or being cut down on the far shore. These images would haunt them for the rest of their lives. After the war, the veterans of the 36th Division fought a different battle. On January 20th, 1946, exactly 2 years after the crossing, the 36th Division Association unanimously passed a resolution calling for a congressional investigation into what they termed one of the most colossal blunders of the Second World War. Their persistence led to hearings before the House Committee on Military Affairs in March 1946. Veterans testified about the conditions they had faced, the inadequate preparation, and the seemingly impossible mission they had been given. Officers spoke of their objections that had been overruled, of alternatives that had been rejected. Major General Walker, who had opposed the crossing from the beginning, testified, "I made my objections as strongly as a subordinate can to his superior." He described how he had proposed alternative crossing sites and approaches, all of which had been dismissed by Lieutenant General Clark. In the end, the investigation yielded no formal censure. The official conclusion, as stated by Secretary of War Robert Patterson, was that the action to which the 36th Division was committed was a necessary one, and that General Clark exercised sound judgment in planning it and in ordering it. Many veterans of the 36th Division would disagree with this assessment until their dying days. For them, the crossing of the Rapido remained what one survivor called it in his congressional testimony, a murderous blunder that every man connected with this undertaking knew was doomed to failure before it took place. Time would eventually soften the rawness of the wound, but it would never fully heal. In the decades that followed, survivors would gather annually to commemorate their fallen comrades. They would return to Italy, standing on the banks of the river that had claimed so many of their friends. They would look up at Monte Cassino, rebuilt after the war, and remember. The horror of those January days in 1944 lived on in their memories. The freezing water, the murderous fire, the sight of comrades disappearing beneath the surface of the Rapido, never to be seen again. It was a horror made more profound by the knowledge that it had been unnecessary, that alternatives had existed, that their sacrifice had achieved nothing. Monte Cassino still stands today, the monastery rebuilt, a place of peace once more. But for those who fought there, it will always be a place of shadows and blood, a monument to the terrible cost of war and the folly of men who ordered others to die for objectives that might have been achieved by other means. In the end, perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the men who fell at the Rapido came from a simple soldier, not a general or a politician. Private First Class Bill Hartung, describing the aftermath of the crossing in a letter home, wrote words that captured the essential horror of what had occurred. There were bodies everywhere, mostly parts, arms, legs, some decapitated, bodies with hardly any clothes left on. And there was always that spine-chilling cry for medic, but there weren't any left. Such was the reality of Monte Cassino, a battle that began with the slaughter at the Rapido and ended only after 4 bloody months and tens of thousands of casualties. It stands as a reminder that war, stripped of strategic abstraction and patriotic rhetoric, is ultimately about human suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. The mountain remembers, even when humanity forgets. Present day, Rapido River Valley. The Rapido flows peacefully now, its waters clear, and considerably less formidable than during that rain-swollen January of 1944. On its banks, memorial markers commemorate the men of the 36th Division who died in the crossing attempt. Nearby, a peace bell stands on the bridge in Sant'Angelo, known as the Bridge of the Four Battles, a testament to the bloody struggle that unfolded here. Monte Cassino rises above it all, the rebuilt abbey gleaming white in the sunlight. To casual visitors, it appears much as it did before the war, a place of spiritual and historical significance. Only those who know its history can see the ghosts that linger among the reconstructed walls. Each year, fewer veterans remain to tell the story firsthand. The young men who fought and died here, whether American, British, Polish, New Zealand, Indian, French, or German, have mostly passed into history. But their sacrifice remains, embedded in the soil of the Leary Valley and in the slopes of Monte Cassino. For the 36th Division, the crossing of the Rapido River represented one of the darkest chapters in American military history. A tactical failure that cost over 2,000 casualties in just 48 hours. The controversy surrounding the decision to attempt the crossing, where and when they did, would persist for decades. A painful reminder that strategic decisions made in command posts can have devastating consequences for the men who must execute them. Monte Cassino itself stands as a complex symbol of religious devotion, historical significance, military objective, and human tragedy. The decision to bomb it remains controversial to this day, seen by many as an act of cultural vandalism that achieved no military advantage and, in fact, made the position harder to capture. The battle as a whole represents both the determination of the Allied forces to break through to Rome and the terrible cost of frontal assaults against prepared positions in favorable defensive terrain. It was a battle that showcased both heroism and futility, strategic necessity and tactical disaster. Perhaps the most important lesson of Monte Cassino is that war is never clean or simple. It is messy, brutal, and often wasteful of human life. The men who died in the freezing waters of the Rapido or on the slopes of Monte Cassino were not statistics or strategic assets. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, and futures that were cut short by decisions made far from the front lines. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just as a footnote in military history, but as a human drama of suffering and sacrifice. The horror they experienced was real, documented in letters, diaries, after-action reports, and testimony. It was a horror born not of supernatural forces, but of human decisions and their consequences. Perhaps the most terrifying horror of all. As the sun sets over the Leary Valley, casting long shadows from Monte Cassino across the landscape, the ghosts of 1944 seem to stir once more. They remind us that beyond the strategic objectives and military necessities of war lie individual human experiences of fear, courage, suffering, and loss. This is the true legacy of Monte Cassino, not just as a battle won or lost, but as a testament to the enduring human cost of war. Thank you for listening. If you are also proud of the bravery of our soldiers, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new historical stories.